Have you ever stopped to think about why, despite all your effort, money never seems to be enough? Paulo faced the same dilemma. Everything changed when he discovered a hidden secret in the scriptures, a key that would not only transform his finances, but his entire life. In just 30 days, his reality began to shift. What he learned about the principle of sowing and reaping was a game changer. The promise is clear: whoever sows with faith will reap an abundance beyond expectations. Want to know how? Stay with me until the end of this journey and find out how applying this biblical principle can transform your life. Many times, we find ourselves in situations where our efforts don't seem to be enough. We work hard, we dedicate ourselves, but the financial results just don't keep up. It's as if, no matter how hard we try, money slips through our fingers. But what if there were a key to unlock the abundance we seek? What if that secret lay in an ancient principle hidden in the scriptures? The Bible speaks clearly about sowing and reaping. In 2 Corinthians 9:6 we read, "Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously." This principle doesn't just apply to our spiritual lives, but also to our finances, relationships, and purpose in life. And that's exactly what Paulo, the protagonist of this story, discovered. Throughout this journey, you'll see how applying the principle of sowing completely transformed Paulo's life in just 30 days. A change that was not only financial, but also spiritual and emotional. Stay with me through this story, because you too can experience the abundant harvest that God has reserved for those who sow with faith and generosity. Paulo was an ordinary man, hard-working and dedicated to his family, but always struggling with finances. He did his best, but money never seemed to be enough. The bills piled up, and the hope for a more prosperous life seemed distant. It was an endless cycle. Every month started with hope, but ended with an empty bank account and new debts. One day, his wife invited him to attend a church service. Reluctantly, Paulo agreed. Sitting in the pews, he listened to a sermon about Luke 6:38, "Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap." The pastor explained that giving generously was the key to receiving abundance, not only in material possessions, but in all areas of life. This message stirred something in Paulo. He spent the week reflecting on what he had heard. The idea that by sowing generously, he could reap in abundance intrigued him. What if this is true, he wondered. Paulo had never thought that the act of giving could be directly connected to his prosperity. To him, money was always something that had to be saved and carefully managed. That night, at home, Paulo shared his doubts with his wife, who, with faith, encouraged him to give it a try. Determined to test this principle, Paulo set aside a small portion of his salary and made a donation to the church. He knew this would be his first seed. The act of giving was new to him, but something deep inside told him it was the right decision. In the days that followed, Paulo saw no immediate changes. The bills continued to come, and his financial difficulties remained. But he felt an inner peace, a confidence that God was in control. He remembered Proverbs 11:24-25. "One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty." He realized that giving wasn't just a financial matter, but a spiritual one. It was about trusting God with what he had. After deciding to apply the principle of sowing, Paulo faced his first challenges. In the first few days, he saw his finances tighten, and the bills kept coming. Doubt crept into his mind. Did I make the right choice? His car broke down unexpectedly, and the repair cost worried him. It was hard to maintain faith amid these difficulties. Paulo constantly reminded himself of Ecclesiastes 11:4. "Whoever watches the wind will not plant. Whoever looks at the clouds will not reap." This made him realize that if he waited for the perfect moment, he would never start. He knew he needed to sow, even when circumstances didn't seem ideal. But every night was a mental battle. He looked at his shrinking bank balance, and with each new donation, the temptation to stop grew. Yet he stayed firm, trusting in God. During his readings, Paulo found Psalm 126, verses 5-6. "Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy." This verse comforted him because he understood that the sowing process wasn't always easy. But God's promise was certain. Even without seeing immediate results, he chose to continue. On the 15th day, Paulo received unexpected news. His boss called him in for a meeting. Surprised, Paulo listened as his boss offered him a new position with a significant pay raise. It seemed surreal. He remembered the biblical promises and realized that God was indeed beginning to honor his faith. Although this didn't solve all his problems, Paulo knew it was just the beginning of the harvest. Paulo realized that sowing was more than giving money. It was about trusting God, no matter the circumstances. And finally, the first signs of the harvest were appearing, showing God's faithfulness. Over time, Paulo began to realize that the principle of sowing and reaping extended beyond finances. He started applying this concept to his relationships, his attitude at work, and his generosity toward others. He read Proverbs 11:24-25. One person gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty. He began to see that generosity wasn't just about finances, but also about how he treated the people around him. Paulo began sowing kindness, patience, and support. He helped his colleagues, showed more understanding to his family, and volunteered at church. Slowly, he began to reap the fruits of these actions. The people around him started to notice his change. He received more respect and recognition at work. His relationship with his wife and children improved, and he began to feel an inner peace that he had previously lacked. This realization made Paulo understand that sowing isn't limited to finances, but touches all aspects of life. He began experiencing an emotional and spiritual harvest that far exceeded his expectations. God's promise was being fulfilled on all levels. After 20 days, Paulo began to experience what could be described as the beginning of the harvest. In addition to the promotion he received at work, other opportunities started to appear. The pastor at church mentioned the need for new volunteer leaders, and Paulo, inspired, stepped forward. This decision, made with a heart full of gratitude, bore more fruit than he had imagined. At work, he was surprised with an unexpected bonus. At home, unexpected expenses started to decrease, and he found himself in a better financial position than he had been in months. Reflecting on these events, Paulo remembered Malachi 3:10. "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it." He began to understand that the act of sowing, in addition to blessing his financial life, was bringing a peace and prosperity he had never thought possible. The harvest was starting to appear, and this motivated him to stay firm in his commitment to God. As the 30 days came to an end, Paulo began to see his harvest multiply. What started with a small financial donation and the application of the sowing principle was now transforming not only his finances, but every area of his life. He experienced inner peace, a renewed sense of purpose, and spiritual growth beyond his expectations. Galatians 6:7-9 echoed in his mind, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." His life was being multiplied in spiritual, emotional, and financial blessings. Paulo was now more connected with his faith, his family, and his community. He saw his generosity being multiplied into prosperity and abundance. God's promise was being fulfilled before his eyes, and he knew this was only the beginning of a journey of continuous growth. On the 30th day, Paulo looked back and realized how much his life had changed. He had started this journey with doubts and uncertainties, unsure if the sowing principle would really work. But now, after 30 days of obedience and faith, he saw the blessings poured out on his life in abundance. He shared his testimony with his community, filled with emotion and gratitude for all that God had done. "Those who sow with tears will reap with joy," he said, quoting the verse that had sustained him through the hardest days. He encouraged others to trust in God, to sow with faith, and to patiently wait for the harvest. Paulo's journey taught him that God is faithful to his word, and when we sow with a sincere heart, we can expect an abundant harvest. His life, now transformed, was a living testimony to the power of sowing and reaping.